Hi, this is Matt McCormick at the Department of Philosophy, California State University, Sacramento. There's my email address and my website address. This is the first lecture of two we're going to have about reconstructing arguments for my critical thinking course. So let's discuss what the next project is. The plan now is to develop a set of skills so that we can move from a text to a formal reconstruction. And here's what I mean by a formal reconstruction. You've already seen several of these formally reconstructed arguments in class that I've been using, but here's how we're going to learn how to do those. So we need to be able to take a case where we've got, say, a essay in the op-ed section of the New York Times, or someone making an argument such as this one. There can't be weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. If there were, then the military forces would have found them by now, or some radicalized group of insurgents would have used them. But military forces haven't found them, and no insurgent groups have used any. So that argument then converts to this argument when we formalize it and put it into our format with numbered premises, justifications, a line to indicate the conclusion follows, and then a justification at the end that shows where the conclusion comes from. All right, so we're going to learn how to convert a passage of text like that at the top into a reconstructed formalized argument at the bottom. And I've got a list, I've got a procedure here, a set of steps that we're going to use that will apply to every one of these cases. So first off, the first thing I need to emphasize is that our goal here in reconstructing an argument, because we're taking either reconstructing our own work or someone else's argument, is to be charitable. The purpose of this exercise is not to score points or to criticize or to defend a particular position. We want to be neutral about the particular conclusion we're interested in. We're trying to get to the truth. We're trying to be reasonable. And one of the big problems here is that we are all quite subject to, quite prone to commit motivated reasoning. That is, we get enamored of a particular conclusion, or we get convinced or feel strongly towards a particular conclusion beforehand, and then we construct reasoning to fit it. Without fairly considering the arguments or evidence. So when we're reconstructing arguments, especially ones for some conclusion that we're opposed to, we need to be highly sensitive to our motivations and be careful and self-disciplined about being charitable in our reconstruction. So charity means, in this case, reconstruct the strongest possible version of the author's position, either in terms of deductive or inductive strength. And the purpose is something I'm going to call collaborative reasoning. Here's the problem. Humans are highly prone to make errors of all sorts. We've seen lots of examples so far this semester. When we reason carefully, it improves the reliability of our beliefs. So if we can enlist the help of others, and if we can employ some deliberate methods or procedures for error checking, we become better reasoners, and we're better off a more reliable belief structure as a result. Okay, so the second step, the second principle to emphasize here, the second step, and actually the first step in the actual reconstruction of one of these arguments, is that we find the conclusion. So in a strange way, we're going to work backwards. The first thing we do is we look at the passage and we try to figure out what's the conclusion. What is the main point being argued for? And in this case, it's, as we've already seen, there can't be weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It just so happens that the very first sentence of the passage above happens to be the conclusion. Now, how do we do that? Well, I can offer some general advice. We're going to take a quiz in this course, and you're going to have to practice finding conclusions, but I can offer some general ideas about what to do. Ask yourself these questions. What's the bottom line? What does the author want me to take away? Oftentimes we can look for certain terms like therefore, in conclusion, it follows that, we should draw the conclusion that, X implies Y, because, since, hence, thus. Words like that will tell us that there's a conclusion that's about to follow or a conclusion that comes before. And we also can think about the logical structure. If we apply a valid or cogent argument structure to the argument, we might see what conclusion is logical. Now, you already have a pretty good innate sense for this. You're pretty good at figuring out what the general point is. But now there's some more specific and more detailed ideas about how to dig it out of the passage. So, for example, here's a few cases. Here's an argument. I need to get a flu shot. If you wanted to decrease your chances of getting the flu, then you need to get the shot, and I can't afford to get sick this year. What's the conclusion in this case? I need to get the flu shot. No other real arrangement of the sentences, no other real arrangement of the premises works here. It looks like this person's emphasizing or directing us towards that conclusion. He's reached the conclusion that he needs to get the flu shot. Here's another example. If we bring our troops out of Afghanistan too quickly, the government there will collapse. And the U.S. cannot suffer through the embarrassment of the foreign relations failure of a government collapse there, so we should not bring the troops out too quickly. So let me just ask, what's the conclusion in this passage? And a bit of reflection, and maybe you can hear it when I read it, should show you that's the last sentence. We should not bring our troops out of Afghanistan too quickly. And one of the reasons we know that in this case is that it has the word so. So says that this is what follows from the reasoning that's above. So the last sentence in that passage happens to be the conclusion in this case. Another example, no Republicans are suitable to be president because no Republicans are in support of gay marriage, and only candidates who are in support of gay marriage are suitable to be president. Now, what's the conclusion in this case? Now, sometimes the conclusions are implicit, but so far we're just looking at examples of explicit conclusions. So if you were to pick one of these sentences, or one of the clauses of the words that are on the screen, which one would be the conclusion? And the right answer is no Republicans are suitable to be president. We know that in part because the word because appears in that passage. And whenever because appears, it'll say something like X because of Y. The clause or the phrase or the sentence that comes before the because is always the conclusion. Now, the only other option here is maybe the last sentence. Only candidates who are in support of gay marriage are suitable to be president. But think about that sentence for a minute. Are there any reasons offered in this passage, or are there any evidence offered to show that only candidates who are in support of gay marriage are suitable to be president? This passage isn't really about that. It's not arguing that those are the only ones who are suitable. This argument uses this as a premise. It takes this for granted without giving any argument for it, and then draws out the implication that Republicans, therefore, are not suitable to be president. So the reasoning goes the other direction here. The first sentence is the conclusion, and the other stuff is the premises or the reasoning. All right, so very first step is that we employ charity in reconstructions. The second step is we find the conclusion. And now you've got a few ideas about how to find conclusions. The next step, the third step, is to identify explicit premises. That is, which specific claims has the author made in support of the conclusion? So once we've isolated the conclusion, we've pulled it out, then we pull out all of the specific reasons or premises or the things that the author has said in order to support that conclusion. Explicit premises are reasons or claims that the author states and that are necessary to support a well-formed, that is, a valid or cogent reconstruction of the argument. And we're going to use EP in our justification to show what the explicit premises are. And I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. Implicit premises are reasons that the author clearly employs and that are relied on to support the argument, but they're not written out or stated. So sometimes there's actually reasoning or premises that are implied but not stated outright. In other cases, they're stated outright, and those are the explicit premises. And we need to get clear on the distinction between those two. And the third step is to find the explicit premises. Now, sometimes there's information that's included in an argument that's not necessary, that we just strip out or we eliminate from our reconstruction altogether. So really, you're only going to find those three different kinds of things in these passages. And be prepared to leave out information or leave out stuff the author says that's not directly relevant and doesn't lend itself to a strong reconstruction. Okay, so how about some examples? Here's another argument. I think she's not home. If she drove home, then her car would be in the driveway, and it's raining, so she didn't walk home. Now, what's going on in this argument? The conclusion in this case is she's not home. Now, we know at least this is an explicit premise. If she drove home, then her car would be in the driveway. And we've been dealing with conditional sentences before so far this semester. So here's one of those, an if-then sentence. Anytime you see one of those, you know right away that's going to be a premise. So you pull that out. We're going to use that. Now, there's also an implicit premise in this example. The implicit premise is her car is not in the driveway. Now, how do I know this? Well, the explicit premise says, if she drove home, then her car would be in the driveway. And what do we get when we combine it with this sentence? Her car is not in the driveway. Well, then that means she didn't drive home. That's implied in what was said above. So then we get this reconstruction. If she drove home, then her car would be in the driveway. Her car's not in the driveway, therefore she's not home. So adding the implicit premise in 2 to the explicit premise in 1 gives us a valid argument reconstruction. It's an example of modus tollens. We've seen this earlier in the semester, and it gives us the correct conclusion in this case. And I've already added the justifications in this example of this reconstruction. It's not the best reconstruction we can do yet, but it's a pretty good first draft. We've added EP for the explicit premise, IP for the implicit premise, and after 3, we've indicated 1 and 2 are the premises from which it's derived. Okay, other examples. Add implicit premises. Or the next step is, once we've found the explicit premises, then we need to add any implicit premises that are necessary for the argument. So consider this argument. Positive thinking cannot help you win the lottery. If it could, then lots of people would win. What's the implicit premise here? Well, the implicit premise here is lots of people do not win. The conclusion is positive thinking cannot help you win the lottery. And when we add this implicit premise, the argument becomes valid. So look at it this way. First premise, if positive thinking could help you win the lottery, then lots of people would win the lottery. Lots of people do not win the lottery. Therefore, positive thinking cannot help you win the lottery. So now we've got the correct conclusion. We've added the explicit premise, and we've got an implicit premise, and it's given us a valid argument reconstruction. Well, I haven't added the justifications in this case, but we need to complete the argument. The first premise is an explicit premise, EP. The second premise is an implicit premise, IP, and the third follows from 1 and 2. But I'll give you more specific instructions for justifications in just a minute. Okay, so we add implicit premises where necessary to make arguments well-formed. Okay, now fifth step, revise, make it valid or cogent, and make it strong. And that means make charitable revisions in language to make the argument valid or cogent if possible, and make it as strong as possible. And put the argument into standard form. So standard form means all of the lines are numbered. You put a line between the premises and the conclusion. So for an argument like this one, we shouldn't worry so much about global warming. There's really nothing we can do about it anyway. Well, reconstructed in standard form, that argument looks like this. The conclusion is we shouldn't worry about global warming. The explicit premise is premise number 2. There's nothing we can do about global warming. And the implicit premise is if there's nothing we can do about something, then we shouldn't worry about it, is the implicit premise. So notice that in this case, I have added an implicit premise and I've made the argument valid. And clearly the author is relying on premise 1 in order to make that conclusion follow. When you read the passage by itself, we shouldn't worry so much about global warming. There's really nothing we can do about it anyway. Well, we need to add premise 1 in order to make this thing work and come out valid. And once we do, we've got a pretty well-formed reconstruction. Added justifications, I've adjusted and modified the language. Now, in more complicated examples, in longer arguments, we may need to add intermediate inferences that play a role in the larger argument. And I'm going to explain those in part 2 of our reconstruction lectures. And I've already discussed this somewhat. Every line in the reconstructed argument should have a justification that shows where it came from. So EP means explicit premise, IP means implicit premise, and 1 and 2 in brackets, or 1, 2, and 3, or 2 and 4 and 6 in brackets means that the line was inferred either validly or cogently from lines 1 and 2. And any other information, anything else in the argument doesn't belong there. If it doesn't play a role specifically in an inference, we don't need to have it there. So for this argument, we've seen this one before. Positive thinking cannot help you win the lottery. If it could, then lots of people would win. When you reconstruct that, The explicit premise is if positive thinking could help you win the lottery, then lots of people would win the lottery. Lots of people do not win the lottery. Therefore, positive thinking cannot help you win the lottery. So now I've cleaned it up. I've adjusted the language. I've added justifications, and the thing is validly reconstructed. And the purpose of learning all of the valid argument forms that we learned earlier in the semester and the cogent argument forms we learned earlier in the semester is so that we can apply those now. So every one of these reconstructions that we do for the homework or for any of these projects for the class need to be finessed as much as possible, where we put that argument into those argument patterns. So the reason for learning about valid argument patterns, like if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P, is so that we can take one of these natural language examples and adapt it and fit it into one of those logical argument patterns. Okay, so our steps overall then are, first off, we're going to be charitable. The point is to get to the truth, not putting someone down or scoring rhetorical points. The first thing we do when we start looking at the passage is to find the conclusion. We find the explicit premises. We add implicit premises or conclusions. We make charitable revisions in language to make the argument valid or cogent if possible and as strong as possible. We put the argument into standard form. And we add any intermediate inferences that play a role in the larger argument. And I'll explain in more detail how to do that in the next lecture. We add justifications after every line, EP for explicit premise, IP for implicit premise. 1 and 2 follows from 1 and 2.